Oh, an office. It has a very university kind of vibe.
Yeah.
You guessed it.
Yeah.
From can you guess from the colors what university? Also the context of where Marina is a student.
Is it Columbia?
Purple.
I'm just trolling. I'm trolling. It's okay.
Purple.
Doesn't
First
really
time
look
rival.
purple from here, to be honest.
What do you mean?
You're very quiet, Dustin.
Maybe now. Could someone say something?
That's much better.
Yeah, okay, I can hear you. My computer just decided it didn't want to output any audio anymore. It didn't even have the like speaker button in the tray. Hey folks, how's it going? Let me share my screen. Got a couple fun agenda items today. Scribe, who can write for us? Can we get a volunteer?
Yeah, I can.
Thank you, Zach. Yes, please add your name to the attendees list. And has anyone not been here before? Would you like to introduce yourself? Caesar, have you been here before? Okay, we'll move on. Feel free to introduce yourself later if you want. Cool. I think first up we have Beck talking about fundable improvements.
Yeah. So I was scrolling down to the notes to remind myself of what happened 2 weeks ago. And so we had a little bit of this meta discussion about like, what is the purpose of this working group? And some of the things that came out of that is people said they really appreciate the forum just to hear about what problems folks are facing and how they're addressing those. The idea of writing documentation, particularly around, I think one of the examples was like account credential reset criteria, or other ways that we could write content that sort of like helps other people who might be maintaining software repositories. And then there were some excellent points that we can't assign things to different software repositories, and everyone is short on time. So things in particular that are high impact and low effort. Then a week ago, we kind of had this conversation about the potential for the Great Repository Audit. And I really, really like the way that Jonathan framed that as a way to turn OpenSSF dollars into meaningful security improvements. I think we're still talking about that approach and where it might or might not work. But that got me thinking about other ways, those two topics coming together, ways that we can help other software repositories deliver meaningful security improvements, and this wonderful pattern that the Python Software Foundation and PyPI have of writing up sort of like individual chunks of improvements that could then be funded, and then once funded, delivered. And so, I don't want to task anyone with going and writing this up for their ecosystem. But I am very interested in continuing to talk about ways that we can turn dollars, maybe from the OpenSSF, maybe from other entities, into meaningful security improvements. And this is sort of one example, I think, of ways to do that. But I'm also open to other people getting feedback about why that approach might or may not work for them, or if people need help with the documentation, or if they need help connected to funding resources, trying to figure out how to facilitate that.
So maybe I can chime in a little bit with my experience with this fundables list, because I was one of the folks that helped create it originally for the Python ecosystem. So we did this a while back when we were looking for various opportunities to get funding, and basically just came up with a list of all the kind of biggest nice to have projects that volunteer maintainers are probably not going to be able to fix because they need some dedicated, experienced work over a long period of time. I think it worked really well. I think for the community, it paints a good story of here's why we haven't done this thing yet. It sort of sets the scope a little bit better for some things that might be common feature requests. So these are specifically scoped to packaging. It was good for that. I think it was also good to point funders at, although I don't think there was a lot of, I think the idea was that it was going to be sort of like a menu, and I think there was less of that than we expected, where funders didn't really come along and say, yes, I want to do exactly this thing off this list. Is more of a way to start a conversation around how they might want to support the ecosystem. So it was good for that, but I don't think there's been a lot that we've been able to actually check off the list as a result. And I think the only other thing I'd note is that, overall, it was very useful. I think if I were to do it again, we'd probably, and we've talked about this also, turn it into a repository of issues rather than a giant markdown document, because that sort of allows for some communication and feedback and discussion on individual fundables rather than just the giant list. And a little more satisfying to mark them as done too. So based on sort of Zach raising this, I'm sort of sensing maybe it would be interesting for us to think about putting together fundable security improvements for ecosystems. And I know we did the packaging landscape a while back, and that sort of identified some gaps where ecosystems might be missing security features that would collectively, like as a bunch of people that maintain these repositories, found to be valuable. I think it'd be important to make sure that any list that is a list of fundable improvements has buy-in from the folks that maintain that ecosystem, right? So I don't think me making a list of things that Ruby gems should definitely get funded makes sense, but I think with support from everyone in these ecosystems, that probably would be useful.
So Dustin, to clarify, you're saying you're envisioning specifically per ecosystem fundables.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, I think if I can guess at the subtext here, NPM did build provenance attestations, and that's something that I think a lot of folks are really interested to bring to other ecosystems, but it's also a big chunk of work. I would be really, like as a maintainer of another ecosystem that is kind of interested in this, I would like to hear a couple things. I'd like to hear like, how much work was it? How long did it take? How many engineer hours was it roughly? Like anything you would do differently or any challenges in the rollout, that kind of stuff, I think would be really interesting to hear from any ecosystem that's already implemented it. Would sort of help paint a perspective of whether I actually want to get someone to fund it.
Yeah, and I think that another interesting, and I don't know if this fits here at all, so feel free to ignore the suggestion, but I think like the TUF project, for example, I think we've looked into integrations and ecosystems. And I think we've learned from that some things that could improve in the project to make that process better. I think even not as part of an integration, but just as like improving tooling, improving usability things, which doesn't quite fit into an ecosystem. So maybe this is for a different place, but it might be another interesting thing to get some external resources pointed at.
Yeah, and that's kind of the point I was getting at, Dustin, is that I think there's certainly a place for per ecosystem fundables, and I heartily encourage that. I also think that there's perhaps some issues that we in this working group can identify that are cross-cutting. And so, for instance, funding for if we wanted to bring TUF to a specific ecosystem would be, kind of scope to that ecosystem. If we wanted to, invest in documentation or process or tooling or whatever it is for all TUF implementations, and then that could be cross-cutting. And I'll table it for a moment, but I do have some specific fundables in mind. I assume at the end of this bullet point, we can throw out a couple of like specifics, not necessarily work through them, but just kind of kick the ball around, as it were.
Yeah, I like that idea.
It just sounds to me, well, I shouldn't say just, it sounds to me like there's sort of a latent fundables matrix or fundables table lurking in the wings for this, with one dimension being things we would like to fund and the other dimension being ecosystems that have or have not been able to achieve that thing. We could use the survey as a jumping off point in that regard. I don't know. I suppose it would be helpful for funders to have a central clearinghouse, or maybe not. I mean, that's the thing. Like most large funders, actually, that's a lie. I was about to say most large funders have sort of like a technology that they favor over others, but it depends. There's a lot of local variation. Anyway, I'm going to stop rambling.
The feedback that I gave to Jonathan on the Great Repository audit, which I would be remiss to not repeat here, is that often we kind of have these grand plans, but it's like we sort of need one ecosystem to buy in and say like, yes, we're interested, and then certainly we could create that table, but in order for any of those pieces to be delivered, it's the classic sort of like two-sided marketplace problem, right? You need agreement from the repository that this is, yes, they're interested in implementing this in the near future, and then agreement from a funder that they're going to cut the check. And so I think maybe this is me thinking too like tactically and pragmatically, but I would really like to see us identify a particular ecosystem who would sort of be interested in going through this exercise, either for just one or two things that are sort of like top of mind for them, or something like what the PyPI did, which is sort of like a more comprehensive, like almost like a roadmap of something that could endure for a couple of years.
I think the other thing that's would be really nice to have here is kind of prior art, right? I think that would be make a lot of these more attractive to funders if they see, oh, like Python ecosystem wants to do build attestations and it's already been done in NPM and it was successful to some, based on some metric or, it exists, right? It was already somewhat proven. I think that would probably help make the case towards funding some of these.
Yeah, so Jacques, I think sounds like overall it's a good idea to try to reuse as much as we can, right? And to be able to point to past experiences and to honestly just let people cut and paste where they can instead of having to write these things from scratch. But I think I'll echo Zach's point, which is we shouldn't, and I don't think this is what you were saying, but we shouldn't block improvements in one ecosystem on having a framework for doing them.
No, I'm not trying to make everybody move at the same pace or anything. That's not possible. I would caution that in many ways, the biggest obstacle is not necessarily knowing what to do. It's convincing somebody to give you money at all for anything. And going through the very fuzzy, vague back and forth is probably where it can help. Here are concrete things that we've identified in advance. But there's still a lot of fuzzy back and forth. Speaking about an ecosystem that I have some familiarity with, a large company took the position that they would basically hand the money over, no strings attached, but with sort of like, we would like it if you spent this mostly on security things, but we're also not going to dictate what it gets spent on, which is a very different funding model, but also even that took a long time to negotiate. Even though it was like the simplest funding model possible. Here's money. Have fun.
If there's a repository that's interested in undertaking this, I would be happy to volunteer some of my time to help them navigate the process of either talking to the OpenSSF or other bodies about funding opportunities.
So I think I'd definitely be interested in maybe teasing out security stuff from that fundables list, keeping that purely about packaging stuff and maintaining something separately around security improvements for the Python ecosystem.
Cool. Should I give anyone an action item, or you two are just gonna follow up on that?
Yeah, we'll follow up on it.
Awesome. Cool. Well then, not to get too into the weeds, but Zach, if you're interested in also experimenting with process around more cross-cutting stuff, I have a proposal in mind. Long story short, and I can give more context on this later and in any kind of fundable document, but the Nix ecosystem is interested in sort of introducing Sigstore signing for build provenance. The blocker for that winds up being a Haskell implementation of Sigstore. And actually, I've identified an organization that's willing to write Haskell bindings for us, but that's kind of blocked on a Sigstore like C library, basically. And so there's already been a proposal to do this, to take the Sigstore Rust effort and to expose a Sigstore Rust library that can be linked against from a bunch of different languages. But I don't think that will happen without sort of a dedicated effort. And so that could be another possible test case. If you're interested, you and I can follow up on that one.
So did we, Zach, I know you wanted to sort of table more discussion. Do we want to do some brainstorming, save it for the very end and go through some of the other agenda items first? Yeah, okay.
Speaking of build provenance, like we can talk about other things. Like we can talk about two-factor authentication. We can talk about detecting malware, but it is a bit of a hot topic these days. So there we go. I guess I have the next agenda item, which is about Docker's build attestations. I was delighted and surprised to see this announcement. They are making use of in toto attestations with salsa predicates, which I think is a great idea. And I hadn't seen people talking about it much. I hadn't encountered anyone from Docker who was working on this. And so in case other people were similarly unaware that this was something they were working on, I wanted to share it with this group, as I think a lot of us on this call are fans of in toto attestation documents with salsa predicates.
So I don't want to jump the gun on Trishang's suggestion for discussion for the next meeting, but do we know, like, is there any attempt at standardization here? Is there, how does this compare to provenance attestations for NPM?
Yes. So, and I'm never sure how much background to give on these sort of things. But just to make sure we're on the same page, in the process of publishing an NPM package with attestations, there's two sets. There's the build attestations, which are sort of well-defined in toto document with salsa predicates. And then there's the publish attestation, which we sort of took cues from the in toto project, but sort of like made up what information we thought should be contained in a publish attestation. I'm not like steeped in the work and the thinking behind the publish attestation. So certainly we should talk about this more when Frederick or Philip Harrison are here. But we are absolutely interested in going through a more rigorous process of talking about what should be in that publish attestation with people outside of NPM, and ensure that whatever documents and standard and predicates that we settle on are something that is widely applicable. I'm just not prepared to have that discussion because I don't have enough sort of like background as to what the objectives are and what alternatives we considered.
Yeah, and I think that Trishak might know more here, but I know that the Intoto project is looking at creating methods to like propose attestation types that can then be more standard and centralized, but still have like some options. Yeah, I'm not sure, Trishak, if you're following that effort more closely than I am, but I think it's 8.9 for folks who are interested.
Sorry, I missed a little something. Which item?
I think it's 8.9. It's the one about different attestation types for Intoto.
Yes, different item, but yes, I know exactly what you mean.
Do you know the number? So at least people can read.
Let me try to pull it up and send it.
No,
Yeah.
it is 9.
It is 9. You're right. My God, fake news. Okay, there we go.
Cool. That's really interesting. So yeah, maybe we can have a larger discussion about that in 2 weeks in the EMEA friendly meeting with Frederick.
Just maybe, but one more on this topic. Does anyone know? So I think that the Docker build attestations then does not include publish attestations. But I'm sort of I didn't look thoroughly enough to know if for sure if that's the case. Does anyone know?
Yeah, I think you're right. As far as I can tell from the documentation, there's 2 attestations. One is the provenance one, right, defined by Salsa, and the other one is the Cyclone DX SBOM attestation. But no publish yet, because that's not standardized yet.
Do we want to involve do we need to talk to the salsa group? And might be a little far off what they're focused on. My understanding is they're focusing on the source security at the moment.
Maybe we can just put something in that channel, see if someone wants to come to the next meeting.
Yeah, since I think next meeting is when we want to go deep on attestation.
Can definitely rope someone into that. The other thing I was going to say, what I thought you were going to say, Jacques, is do we want to pull someone from Docker into this? Because I don't think we've had any representation from them here.
Yes. Yes, we haven't had anybody from Docker, which in some ways is a good thing. And, you know, in the sense that like people trust these documents and standards enough to act independently. That's a positive sign.
I should also make a little note. Oh, sorry, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, I have a thing coming out, which is that it looks like Notary actually delivered something. I saw a picture on Twitter of a big announcement at AWS reInvent, which they did something based on Notary. And I'm like, oh shit, is that still going? So I wonder how much internal drama there's going to be at Docker. And I don't know if that's going to have any influence. I'm so glad this is recorded that I put that out there in the world. Hi, everyone.
Yeah, I just wanted to add the Docker attestations right now seems to use the version 0.1 of the in toto statement on an envelope. So maybe a little bit of syncing to do that.
Yeah, I think another important point to note is that my understanding is that there's a generic mechanism for attaching things to container images. And the specific formats are an artifact of the build tooling here. And so it would be, I think, pretty straightforward to extend the build tooling to produce things in different formats for like the attachment mechanism seems generic enough that I wouldn't view the specific types that are on the table today as permanent or unique.
I did notice that that it appears that they're using their own sort of way of specifying in the registry how these artifacts are related, and the way Docker chose to do it is independent of the way of the OCI 1.1 draft spec. But I try to stay out of OCI discussions.
Yes, discussions.
Oh, so maybe it'd be useful to have someone here that can answer questions about it as well. I saw Zach suggested Justin Chadwell. Does anyone have any, can I give an action item to someone to just maybe reach out, or if anyone has connections, reach out. Zach, thank you. Okay, anything else here? Cool. All right, so this one is mine. So what I'm curious about is if folks are aware of Cargo Vet, and if there's any sort of interest or has been any interest in your ecosystem of bringing it to your ecosystem. So the background for anyone that is not familiar with Cargo Vet, this is some project out of Mozilla to essentially audit third-party dependencies in a sort of somewhat standardized way. So the idea is your team consumes some third-party dependencies. You do something to audit them, like maybe you're doing code review of them or something like that. And then for individual like releases or versions, you publish audits, sort of saying like, yes, I think this is good, or no, I think this is bad, or yeah, it's really somewhat arbitrary, right? So there's sort of different categories of audits that is sort of up to the team publishing it to define. So I think Trishank kind of actually read my mind here a little bit. So I'm curious, with your ear to the train tracks, have you heard any kind of interest in this, or does anything like this sort of already exist in your ecosystem? And then B, yes, does it make sense to think about standardizing this in some way? The other thing about the audits right now is there's no sort of sense of identity or verification or integrity of the audit. So I believe they're sort of published in GitHub repositories and sort of just trusted as a result of that.
A long time ago.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, go for it.
Yeah, a long time ago, we saw that. I'm using we very loosely and vaguely. And yeah, the main concern was that it was like GitHub based. Ideally, it would go through the transparency log. And the other question that was raised, and I don't think I ever had a satisfactory answer, is how do I put this politely? A lot of companies will be a little trepid about attaching their name to a public statement that something is good or not. So it would need some riff on an open source license on the attestation itself to say no warranty, don't sue me if you rely on my statement and something bad happens. Because otherwise nobody's going to contribute these.
Yeah, I think that brings up an interesting point too, because I think one of the ideas is that you have this accountability system where folks like remain trusted vetters if their vetting isn't found to be bad. But I think it's hard to define what that means because like we discover new vulnerabilities and stuff changes.
Yeah, I mean, so when I've talked about like the universal asset graph, I've always argued it should be bitemporal because not only do we want to know the current state of knowledge, we want to be able to recreate our prior state of knowledge to decide whether we made the best decision that could be made at a point in time. And also, yeah, it also argued that you would essentially need subjective statements, right? Like in the sense that there is an identity that is asserting or attesting something, and that your trust as a querying agent depends in part on who as well as what. And I think that's going to be true no matter what. But also in practice, probably what will happen is we'll wind up congregating about certain common, like there will be some Schelling points, right? In this universe where people sort of converge on a policy that everyone follows, like pretty much everybody's going to be like, I trust GitHub and Google 100% to not fuck up. Good luck with that, guys. So I think it's a good idea. I think it's important because otherwise we have to replicate that labor over and over and over, right? It turns the defensive problem into it's still a collective action problem, but it's like building a fence. If somebody doesn't build their segment of the fence is not effective. Whereas what we want is I can't remember the analogy. It doesn't matter. I'll stop now.
I was just going to say, I totally, I would totally agree with you on the trepidation thing about open sourcing audits, but I'm not sure if folks are aware, but Google just recently announced that our Chrome and the Fuchsia team are both doing cargo vet for their Rust dependencies and publishing the audits.
That's good to hear.
Be going okay.
Cool. That's awesome. That's really cool. Yeah, I guess my only, like, apart from the legalities, which you can, if you sort of yell at lawyers enough, they will eventually do what you ask them to do. You just threaten them with fists full of cash. And yeah, really all it would come down to is I think whatever folks adopted would be super duper nice if it went through the transparency log. So we still have just one point to monitor in one consistent way, rather than like some things show up in Git repositories and some things show up in the transparency log and other things show up in a blob store. Hooray.
Yeah, I'm also curious about discovery of attestations in this way too, right? Like, I think having them be available alongside the artifacts probably, and this is something that's been discussed a lot for Salsa, but I think generally makes sense to have them at least nearby. Trishink, do you want to talk a little bit about your thoughts around standardization of attestations, which is totally something I'm going to steal?
Oh, I don't think but thanks. Yeah, I think it's important. Ever since I saw cargo wet, I'm like, this is a brilliant idea, but it'd be nice if we could standardize it so that we could literally wet it the same way, so to speak, across ecosystems. So just like with a publish attestation. I guess that's going to be my tune for the next few meetings. Let's standardize this and that.
It's a good song. You should keep singing it. Has anyone read IT9? Can maybe give us a little summary of like what a standardization process would look like for an Intodo attestation?
I'll answer no, but I think maybe that points to a useful follow-up, which is someone should read it. But then also we could reach out to the Intodo folks and see if they have any thoughts on how best to do this, because my assumption is that their familiarity with the ecosystem will point to getting the format more right than I would.
I can see if someone who has actually like maybe written this can come to the next meeting. I've skimmed it, but I'm not going to claim. I won't summarize it here based on that. So
okay, I'll give that to you then.
Yeah, I'll give that back to them. Yeah.
You're muted, Dustin.
I was going to say, maybe this is obvious, but I also kind of wanted to raise how this might relate to malware, because like PyPI is undertaking a project right now where we are going to sort of standardize the way that third parties report malware to us. And it would be super cool if these were a standard format that we could sort of ask anyone to use and that makes sense across ecosystems. And also we could make public, right? So I think attestations really check all those boxes. And if we add verifiability and identity to that, that would be really cool. Yeah, Zach.
Dustin, where could we follow along? Is there a public link, or is it still in draft phase? Or
you guys are getting the little backstage preview. It hasn't been announced yet, but probably within the month. I'm going to judge by the lack of discussion and talk around that. It probably just makes sense to everyone, and so probably something we're thinking about. Cool. So we have okay, Marina's going to reach out to the Intodo folks, and so I think let's try and make an effort to read IT9 before our next meeting. Anything else about cargo vet or attestations? Jacques, is this one out of place, or do we want to discuss Notary more?
I think it's Notary. Like I got the vague. I have so little detail on this because I didn't dive into it. I just saw somebody say, "Oh, AWS is doing stuff," and they've chosen Notary as their champion. We know sort of main problem with Notary is that it's containers, and that's all it does. And I think the absence of a transparency log makes it much less attractive than it would otherwise be. But I just, as I said, this flew across my radar very briefly today. I don't have much context, but it's kind of interesting because I'd sort of forgotten about Notary because it had sort of turned into, the quest for El Dorado, as far as I can tell, to get to version 2. So I was sort of surprised to see that something had happened. And I thought people who might be interested who had also forgotten, oh yeah, notary is a thing. There you go. Something has come of it.
It's been on my list to reach out to AWS on a number of fronts. They operate two services with built in its name, and I can never keep them straight. One is focused on CI and one is focused on CD. And if nothing else, it'd be really cool to see the well, actually both the CI and the CD system support a concept of workload identity via OIDC, so that, you know, if people are publishing from that system to our software repositories, they can use workload identity instead of secrets. So that was one point I was going to make. And then I guess the other point is just that AWS is sort of notorious for being a platform that likes to adopt lots of different overlapping options and kind of let their customers decide. And then in that platform, they operate several like secret stores or other sort of like HSM backed options for managing key material for their customers. And so the use case that AWS might be envisioning for their customers is a little different in that it's not just a developer on a laptop. It's someone who has an AWS account, which then avails them of thousands of different services, including at least 2 different HSM-backed ways to manage key material. So, you know, I think it's interesting to see people continue to explore different options for providing integrity and provenance, but I'm not terribly worried about you know, anyone sort of like stepping on each other's toes here.
No, I'm not worried either. I think the main difference is that Sigstore has actual momentum. The same with, you know, the Skit folks. It's just like, oh, we're throwing an ETF. You need to do it our way. And it's just like, no one's using it. There's no software. You know, bye. Rough consensus and running code. That's, I thought that was the motto. Well, we got rough consensus and running code. Got an operator schedule. I don't know. Anyway, that's me being a human, you know, reacting to things like I'm a chimpanzee in a troop, and there's been a status move amongst the males. So whatever. Brains are funny. I also have not fun memories of dealing with Amazon HSMs, but that's another story for another day.
Any other discussion on this? Thanks for sharing it. So, thanks for sharing it, Jacques. Okay. Last thing is circle back and do a little bit of brainstorming on fundable security improvements. So 2FA is broad, but what are some like kind of sub things we could do here?
I think it's worth what's the word I'm looking for? Worth distinguishing in 2FA or MFA between using TOTP and using tokens or passkeys. A lot of, I mean, there'll be cases where people have already implemented TOTP. So there's like a follow project to do WebAuthn or passkeys or whatever we're calling it this week. So that's a nuance. It's not a big ticket item.
I'm going to call that probably WebAuthn because it sort of gives you support for everything that's non-TOTP. Yeah, and actually, I don't know if folks are aware, but that was actually a previous fundable thing that PyPI did.
Can you say more, Dustin? Like that has happened?
Yes, so PyPI didn't support, I might be wrong, I don't think it supported 2FA at all, And we added TOTP and WebAuthn support a couple years ago, and that was actually Trailbits that did that work, William, way back when. So, yeah.
Also, the API key work, if I understand, or maybe it was the ability to have an API key that you could scope.
That's
Yes,
worth listing is, you know, tightening API keys, like being able to scope them to a single package, being able to have them expire, are both really good things. So like hardening token logic, also OIDC to token flow, which is still pretty new, but you know, like trusted publisher, like what I think PyPI call it.
Getting back to 2FA, we can move down in a second. I wanted to add support for 2FA mandate rollout. So, you know, I don't know if folks have seen, but PyPI is going to do this by the end of 2023 for everyone. And so there's just a lot of work that has to go into, you know, announcing it, making all the changes to support it, that kind of thing. Definitely a potentially fundable project for some ecosystems. We're just going to do it, I think, but yeah.
I was going to blow out the scope by suggesting we like even have like a higher group of categories, which is like well, and then inspired by the not comprehensive, but maybe medium thought out threat modeling that NPM did. There were lots of people posting what they thought were threats to NPM online, and then posting what they thought our mitigations were to those things, and then posting on what they thought the effectiveness of those imagined mitigations were. So we decided to write them down in one place. And so this may or may not be a helpful framework, but you know, kind of like bucketing and thinking like, okay, well, how are we preventing account takeover? How are we preventing people from submitting malicious or otherwise like confusing content? That could be another frame for how we organize these things.
Related to that is the supply chain taxonomy, which was originally in a paper by the folks who wrote the Backstabbers knife kit or knife collection. I can't remember the exact title now, which had a very elaborate attack tree, very elaborate, like hundreds of leaf nodes. And that's been adopted by the end users working group, and it's still evolving, still being worked on. So for source material in terms of attack paths, that might be helpful. I'm not sure of a link to point to, unfortunately. I'll have to ask the next time I'm in end users to see what the latest is.
Oh, I was going to just add around 2FA. Miles and I have talked quite a bit about defining the like account recovery process, because users will inevitably lose their 2FA, and making sure that that's safe and secure as well. Okay, we sort of moved around a little bit. Do we want to keep talking about 2FA? We want to bump up to account takeover stuff? Let's stick with account takeover. So one thing that PyPI has as well is we integrate with the have I been pwned API, so that you know, if a password does appear in a breach and someone tries to log in with it for that account, we just make them reset their password. Not a huge lift. It would be a pretty small fundable, I would think, but maybe a part of a larger, you know, account recovery, takeover prevention kind of effort that could be included.
We have definitely seen, in the theme of account takeover, we have definitely seen expired email domain takeover as a common attack vector.
Yeah, resurrection attacks. Ruby Gems has a daily job. I can't remember the exact details, but it hits an API that provides a list of expired domains based on the domains that exist in the database. It says these ones have expired, and then it locks that account. Basically, it forces them to reset the account.
I was just gonna say I haven't really seen this. Oh, they use domainer. Interesting. Yeah, I haven't really seen
Domainer,
this
that's it. Yeah.
working. Anything else here? Secret token scanning. What I was going to say is, a lot of repositories have secret scanning integrations, and this could be a two-way thing, right? Like, generally, any credential should probably get reported no matter where it's been published. Okay, let's get back up to the top then. Maybe, is this a single item or this is general framing?
Yeah, general framing.
Okay. For malware, what do we? What I was thinking here is kind of what we're envisioning doing for PyPI, which is and some improvements to tooling around making it really easy to sort of identify what looks like malware and make the takedown really easy to do, to handle volume.
So I guess one question I have, and this ties into the vet stations. In the situation where somebody says they found malware, should the vet station, so they say they publish the vet station directly and then the repo responds, or alternatively, they tell the repo and the repo publishes the vet station. And I can see arguments for both. Although my hunch is that really it should be you report to the repo makes the call and then publishes a vet station or authorizes a vet station. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I sort of imagine happening. So, maybe like in PyPI's case, we have multiple security researchers that report. They don't share nodes, but there's overlap there. So there's interesting things that can be done with like consensus-based automation too. If we have a certain number that reach a threshold, we can maybe not even need intervention by a human. But yeah, I think the workflow is sort of like publishing this. I think there was some interest in doing this with OSV, but I think the scope was a little bit different there because OSV is really primarily concerned with vulnerabilities, and malware kind of, but doesn't exactly fit in that bucket. And also the volume is quite different, right? Or vulnerability is somewhat rare, and malware definitely isn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do we mean to include build provenance under malware, or should that get bumped out?
Yeah, I made a judgment. I think arguably,
I think it's a separate problem.
it could be. There's only two categories, Zach, in your taxonomy, and so I'm happy to pull it out as its own thing. But I also can see the argument for.
I guess it depends on what you mean by malware, right? Is this malware that like replaces existing packages, or this is malware that like is uploaded as malware? Because
That's
the
really
build provenance is more about the former.
a really good point. Like, yeah, I think there's kind of two classifications here. One is just like malware that's closer to spam, and then the second is malware that's a result of a compromise or something kind of more malicious.
We're always very careful in the NPM documentation or other content to not say that a package is secure just because it's published provenance. But of course, having those verifiable links to source code and build instructions enable malware detection techniques that would not otherwise be possible.
Yeah, that's a great point.
That's what I always thought, right? Like as more and more parts of the overall package lifecycle become available in the transparency log, right, it becomes easier and easier to detect a suspicious pattern and to investigate further. It's really just about prioritizing. And my motto that I keep repeating is make the attacker move in the open, because they're going to have to do all these things anyway.
Just a quick time check. We're pretty close to the end of the hour. So I'm wondering if like this is a really awesome list. I'm sure we could keep going for a good while. But how do we make sure that the results of this brainstorm turn into something like useful?
And so I think one artifact we could probably produce here is our working group's high-level recommendations of things that software repositories should do. And then maybe the next step after that is working with individuals in those ecosystems to make a list of fundables. I mean, I really like the fundables thing. I think it works a lot better if it's sort of owned by the individuals who will be overseeing the work or, you know, defining the standard or whatever it may be. But yeah, I'm curious what folks think. Zach?
I think there's huge value in having an opinionated, like if you want to call it a maturity model or like security capability list, or maybe I'm putting too much faith in white papers, but you know, to me, Salsa has had such a monumental shift in the way that people think about supply chain security. And that's because it was a framework that, you know, wasn't too complex, was written in pretty easy to understand language, at least in my opinion. And that was able to kind of like shape and frame people's thinking. And I think there's an opportunity for this group to do the same for software repositories.
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking of something kind of like NPM's threats and mitigations thing, but more like prescriptive. And maybe go into a bit of detail about what each means. It's somewhat educational as well.
Yeah, I will say early in the history of this working group, I, along with a number of others, produced lots and lots and lots of pages that are not in the format that you're proposing, Dustin, but I think could pretty easily be adapted to that. And I think that would be an extremely useful thing for this group to produce. So then maybe AI on that is I can take it and just file an issue in our repository and link to a bunch of source material that could possibly be useful, including probably this brainstorm we just had, a bunch of stuff throughout I think this note stock is like 200 pages or something. It's 82, but like, yeah, I think that, yes, let's track doing that because I think it's a great idea.
Cool. with that, we're at time, so I'll let everyone go. But thanks, this was a really great discussion. And see y'all later.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Zach, for taking notes.